He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 25 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back, Henry, and today we have a special guest. His name is David Moore. Let's enjoy the conversation.
Let's do that.
All right. Welcome to another edition. We have of the Brief Brothers. We have a great guest with us today. His name is David Moore. Henry and I learned about him, discovered him in our search and musings on LinkedIn. David has been posting regularly for, well, he'll tell us for how long, but I think what grabbed our attention was the fact that he routinely shares with the LinkedIn universe advertising done by ad agencies. And before we started recording, we noted that agencies really don't do this anymore. So it's kind of fun.
Themselves, that is.
The advertising for themselves, exactly. They advertise for everybody else, but they don't advertise themselves. So it's kind of fun to look back and see what some of the legacy shops and even some of the smaller shops have done. And one of the first questions that I think I wanted to ask was, why do you suppose agencies aren't doing this anymore? And what are we learning from agencies about what they used to say about themselves to promote themselves? And did this, here's the third question in my one question. Did the advertising work? Did it drum up new business for them? So with that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then you can answer the question.
Sure, that's a lot. Let's see. Hi, I'm David Moore. Started the career as a copywriter at an ad agency. Somehow managed to survive all of the ebbs and flows and acquisitions, and ended up as creative director and made a leap. Let a recruiter relocate me, became executive creative director and president of an agency, and then ended up, now I do freelance. I work for about 3 or 4 different agencies, plus a handful of direct accounts. And yeah, that's my story. I'm sticking to it. Love what I do. And thank you. So I came across, over my career, I've written ads for the agencies that I've worked for. Usually there's some program or something, and we bought an ad, we need to create an ad. And it's right up there with creating an ad agency Christmas card, the holiday card. It's like the most painful process if you've ever been in an agency. It's like, oh, it's because you are putting yourself out there. You're supposedly really good at this. Let's see what you can do. Which is really intimidating, which I do think is one of the reasons that agencies don't do it as much. I got interested in it, though. I got a pile of old Fortune magazines from 1960 through about 1970. And I was flipping through them. I think they're really interesting. And then I discovered that Young and Rubicam, Y&R, is in there every month. And I started to do some research and learned that Y&R ran a full-page ad in Fortune magazine in every issue from about 1930 until about 1969. Wow. Every single month without fail. Some of them were, stinkers. Some of them were sure just brilliant, just absolutely cut through. And that set me on the path to find out why, I want to find more. And once you start down that kind of a path, you start seeing them everywhere. I have done things. I picked up a 1970-some issue of Newsweek, flipped it open, and there's a full-page ad for an ad agency in there. Wow. So they're everywhere when you find them. And I think it does bring the question, why don't agencies advertise themselves anymore? And I have a lot of reasons. One of them that I've come to, one of them is it's just pure financial. I learned from running an agency, you run a really thin margin. So to pull a team off of paying client work and say, yeah, now go do some work for us without really knowing what it's going to do, that's costly. It's intimidating. And I think agencies convince themselves that we don't need it because we build our business on relationships. And it's sort of the turmoil that a lot of law firms went through when it suddenly became okay for them to advertise. Some of them felt it was beneath them and looked desperate. But others figured out how to build an entire business on it.
I think the consolidation of the industry probably is, we got a lot of bean counters that are scrutinizing every penny, in some remote place, not where our agency is. Also you're going to spend $20,000-$30,000 on an ad or an insertion or whatever, and that's money that's coming off the bottom line, that's in the bonus pool, at the end of the year for everybody. So I think that there is a lot of financial pressure. I think also we talked about it a little bit before we started recording. The media environment has changed as well, right? Like there was this kind of water cooler publications that everybody that was in business kind of used to read, right? And it was things like Fortune magazine, things like the Wall Street Journal. And all of that is kind of like, it's been dramatically reduced, right? Like the media have changed. And I think some agencies still technically advertise themselves through what they do in social media, through what they do on the web, but it's definitely not a dedicated program of having a weekly insertion for 39 years or 49 years or whatever it is. So,
and I think that, yes, I hear that excuse about, well, we don't really have the media vehicle, it's harder to reach, but I'm going to poke a lot of holes on that, because if that's what we do as a business, as an industry, we should be really good at saying, no, we know how to find the decision makers, and we know how to create a message and get it to them. If we can't do that for ourselves, how can we expect others to believe we can do it for them?
You made an interesting point before we started recording, David, that many of these ads that you found were category ads. They were basically advertising the whole notion of an ad agency rather than the brand of a Y&R or other legacy agencies. Do you have any, and maybe if we can, maybe we'll put a few up on the screen. Do you have any that you can think of that you thought were really good at communicating the agency's actual brand?
There's one. So Y&R to me is sort of the gold standard because they were so consistent. I mean, I can just think of every month having to keep going to the well for that many years. There are a couple of ads that when I post are two that really stand out as far as getting just worldwide response. One is a category ad, sort of, which is a picture of a backbone, just a line art of a spine. It says the spine, you can't have a good ad agency without it. It means delivering service instead of servitude. They don't necessarily say Y&R does that, but it really says, I think that's the point. Sometimes these agencies run that ad without saying we're unique, but saying this is what we believe in.
Yeah.
So they make that sort of claim. But there's another one from Y&R, is a big full color photo of a woman's face, and you see a tear on her, and it says, "Computers can't cry." And this was from 1964. And it says, "A computer can tell you how old she is, it can tell you where she lives, how big her family is, how much money she makes or where she shops, what she buys and how much she spends, and what she reads and when she watches television. But a copywriter like Greta Nissen can tell you what makes her cry or laugh or buy. Young and Rubicam likes computers. Young and Rubicam loves Greta Nissen." So they're really making a case. But to me, the fact that was 1964.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because Y&R, obviously one of the legacy agencies, always a big brand name within the industry, if not the biggest, one of the biggest. There's the Leo Burnett's, the Ogilvy and Mathers, the DDBs of the world. But I wonder, Howard and I often talk about, that whole idea of category ad, and I subscribe to the theory that if you're the category leader or synonymous with a category ad isn't necessarily bad for you. If you're a competitor and you do a category ad, you're basically advertising that 800-pound gorilla. It's funny, I worked in a lot of fast food, and people at Burger King used to lament that every time they advertised breakfast, McDonald's breakfast sales would increase, because McDonald's was the fast food brand that was most closely associated with breakfast. They kind of invented and perfected fast food breakfast, and still today is the 800-pound gorilla in that. So I wonder if, by virtue of the fact that Y&R was so consistent in their advertising over 40 years, that they had a little bit of that leeway to be able to like stand up for the industry, and in a way that's a statement in and of itself. We represent the advertising industry.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. When you're a big name like that and you're consistent, in that situation, most of your target audience is already going to be aware of you, and they will be, because they will see you time after time, and they will come to believe these people stand for something, even if it's, you know, like there's an ad from, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the agency right now, I'll pull it up later. It's all about how, specifically how their research and their process has generated sales. And they have a chart showing, you know, the national sales chart and our client sales. And it's like, it's a very nice, logical, compelling story. But, you know, the reality is a lot of new business that we've won, it becomes chemistry. You get the client, you guys like each other. So I think that's the other thing that agencies try to do, is just tell the stories like, do we like them? Are they the kind of people that I want to spend time with?
I think that's a nice, if you don't mind, I think that's a nice segue into Henry and my favorite topic, which is, of course, the creative brief. And you intimated in when we're doing email exchanges before we set this all up, you asked me, you know, what would you like me to prepare and talk about? Do you want to talk about, you know, horror stories? And I thought, well, you know what, Henry and I have been doing this now since January, and horror stories is just something we haven't really talked about, although I'm sure we both could share great ones. Since you brought it up, and you are our first creative besides me to be a guest on the Brief Brothers, give us an example of a horror story of a creative brief, and maybe that could be your introduction to your own theories or philosophy about the creative brief and why you think it's so important.
Sure. I think, well, one of the challenges when you get a bad creative brief is it really comes to who creates it in the first place. In the best case scenario, if you don't have a strategist and a planner on staff, then I want to believe that the creative director should be involved in it, because the creative brief should be not written for the client. It should be, the audience of the creative brief should be the creative team. You need to inspire them. And I've had some of the horror stories or whatever was briefs that are written for the client. By the time you read the brief, like, why do we need to advertise? This is the greatest product in the world. It's got so many great things. There are no challengers, nothing else like it. Well, then I guess we don't need it. And you need a brief that actually points out the problem.
I think,
yeah.
I think briefs that are written for the client's consumption, if that were a horror story, it's like Friday the 13th. There's episode 1, 2, 3, up to 1 million. I think that's the number one, you know, faux pas. And that's why Howard and I have had a major disagreement, you know, about the role of the client in drafting the creative brief. And I'm of the opinion that the client should give the agency their version of a brief. And then the agency should have its own internal document. I see it as the creative brief as the first step of the creative process. And just like we wouldn't have the client in our closed door brainstorming session, we shouldn't have them in the works when we're talking about a creative brief that is intended for creatives that often the client doesn't even know who these people are, and certainly don't know them the way the brief writer at the agency, whether it's a strategist or an account person or whatever, knows them. So I'm a big believer in that, you know, the brief, and I'm not averse to sharing the brief with a client if the client gets what I just said, which is you're not the audience for this. And if you're a little bit uncomfortable with the brief, it's okay, because it's not intended to inspire you. It's intended to inspire ideas, and later some of the ideas are a little bit too wacky. We can bring them back, but you don't want to start off by a process that's less than inspiring.
So there are two ends of the spectrum of bad creative briefs for me. There's one that is too much information, where it's just completely unfiltered or uninterpreted, where you get it's a dump of just raw data, page after page after page. Like, you know what, I can't. And the more points you put in, what I know from the creative team being an essay, eventually they're going to pick out the one that they like or the one that they want, or they'll just eyes will glaze over and they'll go do what they want anyway. I want you to, a good planner or strategist is going to filter this all down for me and say, this is what it means. You know, the best creative brief to me, I don't care how many pages it is, it should have a top sheet, a cover sheet that has one sentence on it, or better yet, one word. And that's what you stick up on the wall and say, this is what we're trying to achieve. All the rest of it just support. The other end of that is the briefs that have no information. I've literally gotten one that's had the assignment, write a radio spot. Somebody actually sent that through. It's like, no. But I think the cause of a lot of this problem is in some of the agency structure and just the language that we use, because we say, fill out a creative brief rather than write a creative brief. And I think that is where things start. When you're just filling in the blanks, you know.
I agree. And Howard, I've mentioned this to Howard many times. I think that one of the things that gets overlooked is that brief writing is writing. It's actual writing. And you have to know how to write well and express yourself well, and how to be economical with your words, and how to be pointed with your words, and how to use loaded emotional language in your writing. And I think a lot of people see a creative brief because it's a form with boxes to fill in, that it's a form. And therefore it is just a piece of clerk work that you have to do in order to get a project started. And that's the most destructive, I think, view of a brief, which is it's just a form that we need to fill out at the beginning of the process. You know, I was laughing though, as you said, the brief that said write a radio spot. You know, if I were in the mood to punish that brief writer, I would have had the meeting and presented them 3 radio spots for like 3 different brands that had nothing to do with that, and say, oh, well, here's some radio scripts that we had in our desk from other clients. It's all we need to do is write a radio spot. Here you go.
Yep, I did exactly. So I'm going to tell you a flip side to a good story to play off of the brief writing is writing. So I had an account planner who did, to me, it was a brilliant thing, and I'm going to go ahead and name the client names. Our client was Glidden Paint Company, and they'd spent several years trying to get into Walmart, get distribution in Walmart. And we'd help them on that process. And after like a 3-year process, they finally got in. They got in. Glidden was ecstatic. They wanted to build a whole campaign around this that says, finally, Glidden is at Walmart. And my planner took that information, that input. She went home. She came back the next morning and she just says, no, finally, Walmart has Glidden. And to turn that around, just something that simple, and the light bulbs went off. It's like, yes, you know, turn it around. And it was because of the writing, just the same words, just arranged in a different order.
Yeah, that's what we call synthesis, taking all this information and turning it into something valuable. You can't, you know, creatives, and Henry and I have talked about this before, some creatives have an inclination toward the strategic and others just don't. And that's not a fault against creatives. It's just creatives are a certain beast and they have their strengths and their weaknesses. Bless the ones who have a strategic bent to them, but you can't, like you said, you can't take a 15-page pseudo brief without any point of view and expect the creatives to figure out what's the point. We need someone to help us get there. And even if there is no strategist, and this is where Henry and I sometimes disagree, because a strategist doesn't, not every staff has a strategist. So how do you write a brief without a strategist? Well, you've got to collaborate. And sometimes you need to have the client help you do that. But that's when you have to put a couple heads together and figure out, all right, we've got these 15 things that are so wonderful. What's the one that really matters? Or what's the interesting thing about the customer that will help us talk to her so that the product makes sense or solves her problem? Whether it's an insight or it's that single-minded proposition, whatever that is, You need to have someone there to do it for you. So, the other thing I would add to what Henry's comments about writing is that you have to have someone who's willing to accept the fact that the first draft is the first draft. It needs to be fixed. It needs to be rewritten. It needs to be revised. And like your strategist who went home and mulled it over, she probably took that line and said, finally, we have Walmart. No. Finally, Walmart has us, right? I still, when I'm sitting down and writing my little posts for LinkedIn, I'll write a line down over and over and over and over and over again until I get the way I want it worded. You have to treat a creative brief in the same way.
I agree. And I think that, I love that anecdote because it tells you how important just a turn of the phrase is in a brief, right? And being, like I said, judicious with your words. I have an example, and this is like 20 years later. I still, or maybe 15 years later, I still remember this fondly, and it was a very small account we were working on at the time. I don't mind saying the account either. It was the Cleveland Clinic in Florida. They have a clinic in Weston, and they wanted a campaign, and we had an agency. We were part of a bigger agency out of Boston, but we were working in a small satellite office in Miami Beach. And my father's a physician, so I'm very familiar with healthcare, and I grew up in the environment, and I did a lot of the homework, and I was really digging deep into what it was about Cleveland Clinic that made it so great. And without getting into all the details, there was it was basically this really ideal model of healthcare at a moment in time when healthcare seemed to be going off a cliff. People were really dissatisfied with it. I think it's still even worse today. And I came up with this line for the brief, or a single-minded proposition, which was, it's the Cleveland Clinic is medicine the way it ought to be. And that's what we ultimately like. And the goal isn't for the strategist to write a tagline, but ultimately the creative director was like, I can't improve on this. This is a really good, and people just intuitively understood when you say medicine the way it ought to be, that all of this. So we had a billboard with a stopwatch, and it said, one instrument you won't find in our doctor's offices, medicine the way it ought to be. We had another one that had that it said 100 physicians, 40 specialties in a building, not a directory. Medicine the way it ought to be. So it kind of spoke to all of those kind of benefits that they could uniquely claim, but it did it in a very colloquial way, that turn of the phrase, like, not finally Walmart has Glidden, right?
So the best ways to me when you get there is, though, I like to say, you start at the end, which is not what do you have, but understanding the target audience. That's the best thing the brief writer or the planner can bring, is that insight into the audience. So sometimes your client won't get that, and that's the last horror story that I have. Is I have a true story. A bank as a client, multi-state operator, wanted to do a mortgage campaign, and I said, well, who's the audience? With a straight face, they said, customers and non-customers. Oh, thanks for narrowing it down, guys. But when you know something about the people, then you can try to connect rather than try to push your message out.
So let me ask you something, David. What over the course of your career, what role have you played in terms of helping or writing or assisting or feedback on the creative brief? Do you like to be involved in that? Tell us about that.
I very much like to be involved in that, and I have been in all those roles. I've been in the role of merely having to work from a brief that somebody else hands me. I've been involved in getting approval of the brief and making tweaks of it before it gets to the creative team, and I've written the creative briefs. I think the advantage to having somebody from the creative side involved in the planning of it is you understand what more they need. And to me, it's always, who am I talking to? I want to know every single thing I can about the audience, and not demographics. I want to know, what do they do, how do they behave, and some of that just comes from going out and watching people. You know, it's actually because they'll say one thing, but they do. So I'm going off on a tangent, but
man after my own heart.
Yeah, me too.
So a couple of stories behind that, where we got one we did launched a hand tool was the quick grip bar clamp. It's this amazing tool. You see them everywhere now. We got to be involved in the launch of that product. What the problem was, it did everything a C clamp does, only cost 5 times more. Okay, it really did nothing new. It filled no new need, except it was really cool. When you go to the hardware store on a Saturday, and you watch the guys, our audience, the hardware store is their toy store, and it's like, so if you can show up all the how cool and whiz bang it is, and you know, you have to have the reason to believe. We built a whole campaign around that, showing off how fun and cool it was, with of course the practical application.
But that is an insight, right? Is hardware for certain people? The hardware store is a toy store.
A toy store, yeah.
That's an insight that takes you in a certain direction creatively, and it's not going to be the right direction for every client or every tool client, but for some tool clients or for some specific products, it might be the exact direction you need to go. But that's loaded language right there. That's very inspirational. When you start thinking about being a kid in a toy store, right, it has a certain imagery. You know, that thing that really resonated with me about your bank client and customers and non-customers is that I'm sure that in his mind, he had a fully fleshed out picture of what a customer is and but I think it speaks to the need for a brief, right? It's a convey information. We can't assume that the creatives understand or know the category or know the customers or know everything that's going on. We need to distill what is important of everything that's going on and then convey only that which is going to help them in the assignment. So in his mind, this bank CEO probably knew exactly what he was thinking, but he didn't convey that, and that's really the challenge of a brief.
And more to the point. Yeah, more to the point, Henry. I think this is an example of when we get lost in marketing language. Now, customer and non-customer is not exactly marketing lingo, but it is in that category where the banker knows exactly what he means, and we fall into this shortcut language every day in our workplaces. And then when I come in and I do training, I do a lot of workshops for the ANA, David, and that's, you know, I do how to write creative briefs. And every time I visit an ANA member, all I have to do is pay attention very carefully to the participants and how they talk about their brand and the way they market their brand amongst themselves. And I pick up short phrases, acronyms, little terms that they bandy about amongst themselves, and you start to hear this is their internal language, but it's foreign to me. And the problem is sometimes that language gets into the creative brief. And this whole customer versus non-customer, as Henry said, the banker probably knew exactly what he meant by that, and he assumed that you would understand too. But of course we don't. That's called the curse of knowledge. Curse of knowledge is when you assume that everybody knows what you're talking about and nobody does.
I'm going to take issue with that a little bit. I think in some of my experience, some of my clients, they honestly believe those things. They get so in that tunnel, they can't believe that anybody wouldn't want their product. I had a major amusement park for a client, and it was in essence it's a retail business. You know, you run ads, it's people in the door, people in the door, people in the door. So we'd run, the ad schedule, and then it rained all weekend and attendance was down. And the client would be all upset. The ads didn't work. Well, it rained, for 12 hours straight. And straight face, why should that matter? Because they don't understand. If you can get them out of that environment, they can understand it. But they're so locked into this is what it has to be.
Well, that speaks to something that we've talked about a lot, and I say, we see this pendulum shift it's shifted several times from going out-of-house agency to bringing it in-house. And I think the reason why out-of-house agencies continue to survive and continue to exist is because there will always be a need for outside counsel because of the myopia that sets in. Even if you have an in-house quote unquote agency, when those people, all they do is eat, breathe, and sleep your brand, it's very easy to become myopic and think that the world revolves around your theme park or your bank or whatever. And the agency, and particularly the strategist, is the one that's supposed to raise his hand and say, your target thinks about your brand about a nanosecond every other week. And that's it. So you got, and they think about your category maybe half a second every other week. So you know, somebody's got to be there to be the one that says, in the real world, this isn't how it works.
Yep. I reminded you saying something reminded me of one of the other sort of horror stories we'd get in the briefs, and I would get this frequently. Get a brief written by the account person that says, you know, what's the problem that advertising must solve, right? And lack of awareness was always in there. And it's like, oh, really? So my pushback would be, so if we get on the phone and call a prospect, are you aware that you know, whatever, that we have the product and they'll buy? Well, no. Okay, let's start digging into that and find out then what's the hurdle. But the lack of awareness is not the
I think
problem.
awareness is a catch-all that's used. I've seen brands that have, you know, 93% aided awareness, and then, you know, the client gives us a brief that says awareness. I'm like, I don't think your numbers show that people are aware of you. Maybe you have a consideration problem. You have a pricing perception problem. You have some other barrier. But you reminded me the other big one, and we talk about it all the time, is the conflation of business goals with communications objectives, right? So increase sales. Duh. I know that we want to increase sales, but what's the communication problem that's preventing us from increasing sales? Is it truly an awareness? Sometimes it is. If you're a new player in an industry, then there's no awareness. You need people to get to know you. So you might have a tactic that's just designed to grab attention, and that's all. If they are aware of you and you want them to consider you, then you got to start going down the road of emotional versus rational. What are that? So, I agree. I think awareness is an overused communication objective. That's, again, a lazy way to fill out a box on the form.
Lazy is the word that comes to mind for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, fine.
Unimaginative.
So David, what advice would you give to fellow creatives like yourself, and whether they're in senior positions or not, what advice would you give them about being involved or knowing more about the creative brief?
The first piece of advice is to remember or think of the creative brief as a starting point, not an ending point. Fundamentally, take it and build from there. But so often it's, if somebody who gave you the brief, all they did is fill in the blanks, then your attitude becomes, well, okay, I'm just going to fill in the assignment, which is fine because, you know, you'll be okay, but you should take it as a challenge to say, oh, hey, what else can I do bigger? And I think don't be afraid. If you want to be involved or you think you can be involved, the story about the hardware store, your toy store, that was me as a young copywriter. It's like, you know, I wanted to go out and watch that. It's like, okay, cool. And once you start raising that, some other people in the agency went, hey, this guy's got ideas. Let's start bringing him in. So I think advocate for yourself, because you know, if you don't have good input, you're not going to get good output.
You didn't ask me, Howard, but as you were asking the question to David, if I were giving advice to creatives, it would be to embrace the strategist. I think that there's too much division in departments, and I've always had close working relationships with my creatives. I came from up in a very small agency, and that kind of forced us to all be very close together. But as my career progressed and I moved from agency to agency, I always made it job one to become accepted by the creatives. I put that on the strategist, but I also put it on the creatives, because I think that a good strategist can be a creative's best friend. And I think that don't view the strategist as an extension of the account team. really bring them in and make them almost an extension of the creative team. And that is when I think the magic happens.
Well, I think you've heard me say from the very beginning and long before we started this show that my whole ballywick is collaboration. Now, we've had our disagreements about what that means, but I think the collaboration between strategist and creative is essential. But also, we should have collaboration among all team members. There's this long-standing, whether it's a myth or whatever you want to call it, that the creatives are on this side and the account folks are on this side and they're fighting with each other. The way I prefer to describe it is the account folks and the creatives and the strategists and the client are all on this side of the table, and on the other side is the customer. And we're trying to have this conversation with the customer and knock down any barriers that might exist between all of us and the customer. So collaboration is like my number one thing. And that's so, yeah, this call it friendship.
This is where I come in and say real world check. It's like world peace. Okay. It's a
goal. It's a goal.
It's a noble goal, but we also have to recognize that there's a reality, right? The account team has certain priorities and things that they want to have that they in an ideal world would get. The creatives have a different, idea or philosophy or goals of their own. And so I think a strategist is really important in bridging those worlds. And usually the account team has more of a business and client orientation, as it should. And the creatives have the more artistic and creative orientation, as they should. And I think that that's really the role that the strategist, I have to be that. I do the analogy of I have to walk hand in hand with both of them and really make those things work. That's how we get to world peace.
Mommy and Daddy are fighting again. You got to keep getting together. The last piece of advice I have to your question on the creative teams with dealing with briefs is don't be afraid to push back.
Yes.
Because one of the biggest pet peeves I would have as a creative director, when I didn't see the briefs, because it's impossible to see everything when you're a fairly large agency, stuff is going through. And when I get like a day or two before the assignment's due, and I start to see the work, and the team would have mediocre work, and I, basically crap all over the work. And then they'd say, well, the brief is no good. It's like, well, you know what? You should have raised your hand and said something about that 2 weeks ago when you got it, not a day before it's due.
Right.
So you get it, and it's not something you can work with, push back. Come to the creative director, come to the planner, come to wherever.
I've just been flipping through this, John Haggerty's book on advertising, and he has a chapter. He says, never just accept the brief. Always challenge the brief.
Sir John Haggerty.
But, yeah, exactly, Sir John. Well, he and I, are friends.
Okay. While we're on strategy and briefs, the other thing I want to mention that I see way too much of, and I want you guys to help figure out how to solve this. I see a lot of work that purely looks like they just took the creative strategy and put it up on an outdoor board or a billboard or an ad. It's like, could you take
position is showing?
I have, there's a local example that there's an outdoor board that I think was a great insight for a home builder. And it's just simply a line. It's got a smiling family. And the line says, why buy a used house? Okay. It's an interesting idea when you're trying to sell brand new homes, but that's it. That's all you could do with it, is put that line on the board. So that's like looking back at the Volkswagen ads. If they had just said, buy a more fuel efficient car, buy a car that, they took that idea and did things with it.
That gets into the whole, and we did a whole discussion recently about, idea ad versus just an execution, and we talked a lot about that, the classic Volkswagen campaign. And to me, what really made it great wasn't just what they said, because what they said was powerful, but it was the distinctive way that they said it. Like they had a repeatable formula that they used that you always recognize that. And many decades before Byron Sharp and mental availability and all these concepts that are de rigueur today, they were doing that. They were saying, you know what? Other car ads use illustrations, we're going to use photography. Other car ads have like all this clutter in them. We're going to use white backgrounds. Other car ads use serif fonts. We're going to use sans serif fonts. We're going to use bold headlines. So to me, what you're saying is they got halfway there. They had a really a nice idea, but they could have executed it in an eye-catching and distinctive way that then you would associate only with that brand of home builder, and it would kind of lodge itself in your consciousness, and you would understand it.
I would say that that's actually not a bad single-minded proposition.
Yeah, it's exactly. Then begin there.
As Sir John would say, the proposition is the first ad. He said I would take the proposition, I'd write it down on a piece of paper, I'd put a picture of the product above or below it, and I'd stick that on the wall. And I asked myself, okay, is this a good ad? It didn't have to be a great ad. It just, is it a good ad? And that's great. If it's a good ad, then my job as the creative is to make it a better ad. And that's the springboard. It's the spark.
So in that example, if that's the brief that our talented planner strategist over here gives us, which is a great line, the idea for the execution should be to get the audience 90% there and let them make that last 10% leap. I use the analogy, it's like a spark plug. If you close the electrode all the way, no spark will happen. I'll communicate, eyeglasses are on sale. Okay, great. But if you make the audience complete that last part, look at yourself and go, oh, now you've got them.
The creative director for whom I worked and from whom I learned the most is a guy named Tom Jordan, and he ran Hoffman, York and Compton in Milwaukee.
Yeah. Okay. I know.
And he used to say to me, well, not to me personally, but he used to say to us, he'd say, draw the circle, but don't complete it. Trust the audience to figure it out. And, is it 90%? Is it 80%? Is it 96%? Okay, you need to figure that out. But, it goes back to David Ogilvy, who said, never underestimate the intelligence of your audience. And too often today, we don't have any of that trust for our audience.
I love the analogy of a spark plug because it's, I think it's and I agree. I think that there's something about an ad where you as the consumer complete the spark that makes it stickier. It makes it grab more attention. It makes you feel invested in the brand a little more. It's almost like an inside joke that you get, and there's like a little dopamine reward if you as the consumer are closing the circle rather than having somebody just say stuff to you.
Yeah, exactly. It's an intelligent kind of advertising.
You feel smart. You're like, oh, I get it. Suddenly I'm on the inside.
Exactly.
Absolutely. All right, David, is there anything else? I want to give you a chance to kind of maybe vent and talk about something that really is on your mind and matters. And here, here's your chance.
I think this has been really good. I mean, I got a million stories. I've been doing this long enough. But the venting is, why don't ad agencies advertise for themselves? And I can go off into a whole nother one on that someday. But
what? I'm inspired, and I'm going to lead the charge here at Zuby to say, you know what, guys, we haven't been doing enough to promote ourselves. We need to do more.
Well, and Zuby has done some. I have a couple of Zuby ads in my archive.
David Moore, thank you so much for being with us here on the Brief Brothers. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having me, guys. See you around.
Good stuff. Henry, we're back with our creator review. We're going to look at a couple of spots for SeatGeek. These are 30-second spots. We'll check the agency later, but let's take a look.
SeatGeek. Oh yeah, my life used to be quite boring. Just sitting on the couch, at the office, the occasional restaurant. But now, wow, I'm living the dream. This week alone, I've been to 2 basketball games and a concert. I've never felt more alive in my life. Get your seat tickets to sports, concerts, and live events. SeatGeek. Get your seat in a seat. SeatGeek.
I think baseball games can be a great first date. I mean, why not, right? Who made up this rule? There's nothing more romantic than 2 people sharing their passion, especially if you have great seats. Because then you can make it to the kiss cam, and if you make it and he kisses you on the kiss cam, and then it's real. It's the real deal. Like ring stuff, wedding stuff.
Get your seat tickets to sports, concerts, and live events. SeatGeek. Get your seat in a seat.
Okay, well, this is the first time one of our guests has joined us to offer his thoughts on the creative. So since you're our guest, David Moore, we'll start with you. What is your reaction to these two spots?
I'm not sure I want to be a guest watching ads if that's the kind of thing you're looking at. I'm mildly disturbed by that ad. I mean, I can appreciate that they do a nice job of driving the brand name home by focusing on the seat, but I really don't like the thought of talking ass.
And you can say ass on this show. It's perfectly okay.
I just did.
I won't bleep it. Don't worry.
Henry.
So I'm going to be a little more charitable for this thing. I think it passes the gets your attention test in terms of it's not every day you see a talking ass. It also is definitely a unique way to talk about events without actually using stock imagery of a concert or all the kind of lame things that you might expect. I saw in the one ad, there's kind of an allusion to the pandemic and sitting on the couch a long time, and so it's kind of timely in the sense of this is an industry that has been hurt for a period of time, and now people are starting to get back into doing things despite the fact that cases are through the roof again and all this. I think a lot of people have just decided we're going to live with this thing and move on. But that aside, I think the one area, even though they start with SeatGeek at the beginning, which I think is clever. I think it's good to get the brand name in early on, what brand it is. And then at the end, and it does in a little super say SeatGeek user. I don't think that the logo itself is anything that is distinctive and grabs your attention. And then maybe there's something they could have done with music or whatever to make it more distinctive and campaignable over the long run. But I think, like I said, in terms of getting your attention and speaking to what, basically their core mission is, which is selling secondhand seats to events, I think it does a good job. I'm going to give it a mild thumbs up.
Okay. I never thought I'd hear myself say this, but I'm kind of wishing it was a 6 second. It's like, how much of a butt do I need to see to get the point across? I think there was too much emphasis on the narrative, which I don't think really added to the point that they were trying to make. You could have gotten it across in 6 or maybe 15 seconds, and it's still, in fact, I think it might have been better.
I'm going to agree with you. I think that would have been much better because I don't need to keep seeing the butt cheeks moving. But
yeah,
once it gets my attention, to your point, I get the attention. Okay, get your butt in a seat. Cool. Now I'm out. That's all I need.
Right. And I guess the second critique I have of it is, and I don't know if this is a post issue or what, but the butt didn't quite jive with the speaking. I wanted to, we've seen animals on screen and animation has allowed their mouths to move to words so perfectly that you are fooled. This butt didn't fool me.
No, that didn't.
Not even close. I mean, a talking tuchus needs to really have its lips move, its cheeks move.
I'm not sure what to say. Butts.
Yeah, now that's a technical issue, and it's a minor thing. Because I think it did get my attention, but less is more here.
I think the other critique I would have though is that they're selling the category of go to events. There's not a whole lot that makes me think, oh, this is why I need to go to these people. I could see that, and if I'm motivated at all, I might just go buy first, I don't have to go to the secondhand market. I might just go buy the regular one. They're not doing what makes you want to use one of these services, which is these are hard to get seats or you can't get them anywhere else or whatever.
That's a really good point. Really good point. What makes this brand unique besides the butt?
The other observation I had was, especially in the second one, I thought the copywriting was kind of clever. I thought the whole thing about the kiss cam, and it's like, if you've ever been to a basketball game or a sporting event, like you instantly recognize like some of what she was talking about as being true. And it kind of does create in you a little bit of a desire to get back out there and go to a live event in that sense. And I think the point about the length is also a good one. Howard and I have talked about in the past that, even in my own experience, we did a commercial I was very proud of in that. As a 30, I loved it, but the creatives are always in love with a 60. And to me, the idea was so simple that it didn't need to be in a 60. In fact, the pacing of it was too slow in the 60, whereas in the 30 it was perfect. So I think that, unit length, maybe, a 15 here or a 30 in which the butt isn't talking the whole time. Maybe you go smash cut to an announcer and something else. But there's certainly...
So what would have made that interesting is if you heard the narrative, you didn't see the butt talking, but until the end, then you realize it's the butt talking. It was like, oh my God, now I get it. Because like we were talking about earlier, suddenly I get it. Now
That's why you were an agency president.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. A butt reveal. That would have been great. All right, good stuff. David, thank you so much for joining us. Henry, as always, good stuff. He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.
Bye.
No more talking culos.